working group on open science monitoring frameworks. And as you can see from the agenda here, we'll start with some very brief background, and then swiftly followed on by a presentation, and then a discussion on the draft survey for member states in terms of reporting on the implementation of the open science recommendation, and then a discussion on an output analysis based on inclusive global scientific scholarly databases. So without further ado, if we can jump to the next slide, please, I'll just give a little update or overview. So as you know, just to locate us, so we're holding this meeting, of course, in the context of the implementation of the UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science. And as I'm sure you're aware by now, to do this, we've set up 5 different working groups, and some of you are members of more than one, of more than this one. And they are, as you can see on the screen here, on capacity building, on policies and strategies, on financing and incentives, on infrastructures, and on the open science monitoring framework, which is the one we're doing now. And as we mentioned, this is the second of those meetings. Just to reiterate the specific objectives of this working group, of our working group now, is to be able to assist the Secretariat in the development of a monitoring framework for the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation. And before we really get into that detail, I'd just like to focus on a little bit and explain the timeline. And if you look at the dates here, you may, see that this is far into the future, and but there are good reasons for us to go on with this now. There's many steps and hurdles we need to traverse, so it's necessary to start that now. So we've set ourselves an initial deadline for this working group to have prepared a final draft of the survey by June 2023. So just over, say, 5 months' time. And then the more formal steps we need to take, and you'll see, this takes some time, and various of them. So for the spring 2024, so we'll go through and finalize that, but for spring 2024, the survey needs to be adopted by the UNESCO Executive Board. And then we use the period from that board to the spring afterwards, so then working from 2024 to 2025, and that will be working with the member states in assisting them in filling out the survey. And then in the autumn, or the fall of 2025, we have the preparation of the synopsis report of all the responses received. And then in the 43rd General Conference, that's November 2025, I know this sounds a long way away, the report and comments from the Executive Board need to be transmitted to the Governing Council for consideration. So that really is a little bit of an explanation of all the steps we need to go through, and that it is a long process, but we need to hit those particular milestones or deadlines. If we can go to the next slide, please. So from our first working group, which was held in September last year, we had some very good discussions and follow-up, and these are summarized in the report. Now, I hope everyone who participated has a copy of that report, or if you didn't, you may have already seen it. If you don't have a copy, there's a scan of it there. You can follow this QR code, or the link to the web page will be provided at the end of the presentation. And if you have any problems locating that, please let us know. And I'll just very quickly summarize the key questions that were considered in this first working group. And they were essentially what should be the guiding principles for such a global monitoring framework for open science and for the implementation of the recommendation. To start to have a good understanding of what is already being measured and monitored, and what else can be or could be measured and monitored, how we ensure harmonization and structure in reporting, and then also some questions regarding the challenges and opportunities of cross-border and multi-stakeholder collaboration in development and use of open science infrastructures. And then finally, one of the key questions was the existing approaches to efficiently and effectively monitor open science practices. And then just we can mention some of the key messages that were summarized in that meeting, and you'll see these in the report, so I won't spend a huge amount of time on this, and we'll focus on this more. But really the key challenges in regard to the development of this global monitoring framework, due to the scope and diversity of the elements, practices, tools and incentives, the distinction between monitoring the implementation the difference in monitoring the implementation and monitoring open science more generally, the focus on developing the framework first, and then some of the key challenges which were questioned, to not only look at outputs but also inputs and impacts, build on existing indicators first, and then build on that, and then the contextualization of how the indicators were used. And in terms of, I guess, outputs of what actually came out of that meeting, there are 4 things here, and 2 which have already been made progress on. And firstly, I mean, the recognition that this monitoring of open science is a complex and multi-layered exercise, which was recognized will require a pluralistic monitoring framework. And we mean pluralistic in both senses, both in terms of having multiple and complex elements, but also in have many and different, let's say, varied stakeholders. So the first of the kind of outcomes was the survey for member states to report on policies and actions promoting open science in line with the recommendation on open science. And this draft was shared with the working group in December, and we thank you very much for the comments, and we'll discuss that a little more very soon. And also an output analysis based on inclusive global scientific scholarly databases. And then the 2 other elements are surveys to research organizations regarding their open science initiatives, and opinion surveys to some specific experts regarding the values and practices of open science. So without further ado, we'll focus on these first 2, and in a seamless transition, then I shall please pass over to Anna Persic to take us through this this first one, so on the report on the survey. Anna, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Ezra, and really thank you to everybody for connecting and joining us. It really is a pleasure to see again a lot of people who are interested, and a lot of people who have really been with us from the beginning of this exercise. Thank you, Ezra, also for introducing the work of the working group, and a little bit what happened in the first meeting, which is the basis on which we have developed the survey that we have shared with you in December, and that we want to discuss today and get more inputs. So basically, the idea behind the survey was really to focus on the 7 areas of action, which are integral parts of the UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science, and to touch and to really focus on exactly the actions which member states agreed on during the intergovernmental negotiations, and also when they adopted the final recommendation. So we were very reluctant to change any kind of specific wording in these actions, and really tried to very closely follow the different provisions and actions that are actually in the recommendation. The 7 areas of action, just for everybody to be on the same page, is promotion of a common understanding of open science and its benefits as well as challenges. Then developing an enabling policy environment for open science, investing in infrastructure and services for open science, then investing in training, education, digital literacy, capacity building for researchers and other stakeholders to be able to participate in open science. Another area of action was on fostering a broader culture of open science and aligning incentives for open science, promoting innovative approaches, and then promoting international and multi-stakeholder cooperation in the context of open science. So as I said, really in our in the draft that we have prepared, we stick to those areas of action, and we try to make as much as possible very explicit what we were trying to ask to the member states. I'm not going to read through the entire draft because you have seen it, and if you don't, we will share it also in the chat. But as I said, looking into the different provisions under each area of action, we came up with 3 to 4 questions per area of action, because we also did not want to overload the survey with too many questions. And the idea here is really to get some kind of a qualitative picture of what is happening at the national level with regards to the implementation of the Open Science recommendation. The reason why we are also focusing on this more qualitative way in this survey, qualitative information, is because the idea would be that eventually there would also be a more quantitative part as much as possible that would accompany also the survey itself. So here is the survey that, as Ezra explained, it's a draft that we want to discuss with you today, get some feedback on what you think about the different questions, what is missing, what should be stronger, what should be more explicit. But the idea then is also, of course, it is the member states who will both approve the questionnaire, the survey, and then also be filling the questionnaire. So just very briefly on some of the questions that we have here, in terms of the first area of action or around the promotion of the understanding of open science, the questions are around the ways in which the recommendation has been promoted in the country with appropriate ministries, institutions, if it has been also translated in national languages, if there have been some awareness raising activities or other activities organized in the country to promote the recommendation. Also a question on values and principles of open science and the actions that have been undertaken to promote these values and principles of open science, again, as defined in the UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science. With regards to the policy environment, the questions, of course, are around national policies on science, technology, innovation, also legal frameworks. Another question is on other policy instruments, implementation plans, strategies, roadmaps on open science that might exist at the national level. We are also asking a question for the institutional level. I see that you don't see the document on the screen. Let me see if I can change that. Sorry about that. We'll see if I can share a little bit differently. Okay. Can you see the document now?
Yes. Yeah, we can see it clearly. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I hope that you were able to follow with the document that we have sent in December earlier and for the meeting. It's exactly the same document. We haven't changed anything. Yes, I was talking about the different policy instruments and policies, strategies on the national level and also at the institutional level. We were also asking about specific funding mechanisms. And again, really, all of these questions follow strictly what is under the provisions of the recommendation, of the UNESCO recommendation on open science. There is a series of questions, again, as I said, on funding and how, if there are specific funding mechanisms, if open science principles have been integrated in the existing research funding mechanisms. And then, again, following on what is in the recommendation on the public-private partnerships around open science. In terms of investment, again, we are following the recommendation, asking about the different infrastructures and services that exist on national level, and going back to the recommendation in terms of defining what these different infrastructures are. We are also asking the countries if they are hosting or funding any federated regional or international information technology infrastructure for open science, and about the promotion of North-South, North-South-South, and South-South collaborations, again, around open science infrastructures. A series of questions then around investment in human resources, training, education, digital literacy, about the existing programs for different audiences, frameworks for open science competencies that may or may not have been developed in countries, again, strictly referring to the specific provisions in the recommendation. There are a few questions about open educational resources, but knowing that there is a specific separate recommendation on open educational resources, we have left that a little bit more open, because of course the countries will also be reporting in that particular setting of the open educational resources, and we will try to combine those reportings also in the context of our reporting for open science. In terms of fostering a culture of open science and aligning incentives, these are the series of questions looking mainly into research assessments and evaluations, and asking the countries whether there are some existing revisions happening to these evaluation systems in line with the principles of open science, again, as it is stated in the recommendation on open science. We go a little bit more into detail as to what should or should not be included in the evaluation of researchers and rewarding systems, again, as I said, following the recommendation. We have then some questions around innovative approaches for open science at different stages of the scientific process. Some of the questions here look into participatory methods, some of the new, more innovative ways of doing research at different stages to open up the entire scientific process. And then again, we are citing here some of the recommended actions, again, as it is noted in the UNESCO recommendation on open science. In the end, we have a couple of questions, 3 questions on the promotion of collaborations in the context of open science, trying to understand if there are some new collaborations that have been set up since the adoption of the recommendation, both in terms of scientific collaborations, but also in terms of collaborations around infrastructures or around funding of open science. So I'll go back to the other presentation. Here we go. So that's like the big summary, let's say, of the draft survey that we have prepared so far, and we are very much looking forward to your additional comments. We have received some very interesting comments already from several members of the working group, and we would very much want to thank you for that. And I've tried to just summarize very briefly the comments that we received, but I really do hope that people who have sent the comments will also be able to, during this meeting, explain a little bit more what they meant and how they see this survey improve. So, of course, one of the most important comments that everybody has is that we have to make sure that it is user-friendly as possible. And if we use any platforms for the survey, again, that it is very easy to use and that is clear for the participants of the survey, for those who will be filling it in, what they have to do and how to move from different from one question or section to another. To make sure that people who are filling in the survey know exactly what is expected, of course, there is need to add an introductory or an explanatory paragraph to the entire exercise. And of course, that is something that needs to be done. We will do that. And also to make sure that we make it very easy from the survey to access the actual UNESCO recommendation on open science, because as I said, 99% of what is in the survey comes directly from the recommendation, and the recommendation provides then a little bit more context for where these questions are coming from. So it's very important that there is a very easy link between the survey and the recommendation itself. Of course, some of the questions will need additional explanatory notes or maybe some examples so that the people who are filling it in can relate better and can better respond to these questions, which is also something that makes a lot of sense, and it's something that we should indeed do to assist the member states while they are filling in the survey. Then we had a comment from one of the members of the group saying that if the answer is no, because many times you saw the answer is yes, no, and if we say no, then please try to explain what the reasons are for non-compliance. But at the same time, we did have another comment from another member of the working group saying that there are no provisions for non-compliance in the recommendation because the recommendation is not legally binding. So it might seem to member states that we are trying to in a way, see the reasons why they haven't done something as a way of bringing in negative parts of the implementation, while the idea would be really through the monitoring of the implementation to focus on the positive aspects and more concrete achievements rather than trying to understand why certain things have not been done, particularly in the beginning, while many countries have maybe not put in place many of the policies or other recommendations from the recommendation. So that is something also that we can discuss and see whether there is need or no need to ask for explanation when the response to one of the questions is no. Other comments, there is a need to also include an I don't know option, which is also quite sensible, to refine the list of infrastructures. These are more technical, maybe comments, to make some questions on rewarding more explicit, maybe also to add some specific questions on engagement with society and other knowledge systems, because the fear in a way is that the member states might respond to this questionnaire only focusing on open access and open data, which are those elements of open science which are kind of more known, and that because there are no explicit questions around engagement with society and other knowledge systems, that they might leave that out. So maybe a couple of additional questions, but specifically looking into engagement with society might be a good way to make countries think about these parts of the open science more explicitly. There was another comment to be more specific, transform some of the nominal options to ordinal, meaning instead of saying yes and no, trying to see yes, and then from 1 to 5, I agree, strongly disagree, agree, very much agree, or disagree, so that we can also do some statistical analysis on that. Or when we are talking about funding, maybe actually put the numbers just to have an idea of how much funding there is in different countries for open science. And again, as I said, these surveys can also with time evolve because countries start implementing and there is more information that we have, and we can keep some of these comments and some of these ideas for a kind of a next stage in the reporting periods also. There were a couple of kind of fundamental questions that were also asked by our members of the working group who provided their comments in advance of this meeting. To whom is the survey addressed and which actions need to be reported? And should it only target national or regional governments or agencies? So the answer from our side is that the survey is addressed to member states. We say to member states. And of course, we are keen on getting replies with regards to national and regional agencies or governments and what they are doing, but these are surveys that go to national focal points who also, of course, can and should see what else is happening in the country, including at the institutional level. So we can discuss this also today in the meeting, because I think usually the surveys on UNESCO recommendations on open science touch upon both national action, but also some examples and of institutional actions. And I think this is going to be also the case for this this recommendation and the survey that we have here. One thing that we are thinking of now, also based on these preliminary comments that we received, is that it will be important to develop guidelines to accompany the survey. And here your inputs from this working group will again be very useful, because it will help us to refine this survey, and also to guide those who will be filling it in the right direction in a way. And then we do have a little bit of time between the time that the survey is kind of adopted and sent to the member states to the time when they have to report back. There is like a year in between, and we can hold some regional, national workshops for the different focal points, again, to help them in understanding the survey better, giving them some examples, and also, again, using this as an opportunity to do some peer-to-peer learning, exchange of information, and also lessons learned on the implementation of the recommendation. So I think I will stop at this point. I will stop with the presentation, and I would be very, very happy to hear from you all what your comments are, maybe also those who have already sent comments, to provide a little bit more information around those comments and why, some rationale. So if you could let me know who would like to speak, I'd be happy to give you the floor. Okay, I have Irina with her hand up. Irina, Happy New Year.
Hello, Happy New Year. Thanks a lot. It's an excellent document. So I have a couple of questions. The first one I wrote in the chat. Maybe in some cases where you have yes, no, maybe there is a space to incorporate in the planning stage or planning 2 or something like that, that would work with the wording of the question, because maybe that would help to identify some countries who are in the process and maybe offer some help to them. Then another point I was wondering about, maybe for some countries that already have aligned policies in place, like, for example, French second open science plan already, because there might be there are some results from the first open science plan, which is, I think, aligned with the recommendation. So maybe we could ask an optional question, which would be, could you summarize in a couple of sentences an impact that your policy had on research, development, innovation? And maybe it would give us some narratives that we can use when we advocate for open science policies in other countries. I know that it would make a survey longer, but or maybe there is another way to, maybe, I don't know, go back to them and ask for this impact narrative. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you, Irina. Yeah, I think that's a very good idea, because indeed, and in the spirit of we want to learn from each other, those who already are in the process of implementing their open science policies, it would be great to have at least some indication of what the impact, if they can tell us at this stage what the impact is of their policies. I think that's a very good idea as well. And then, yes, I think in some questions we have asked if they are planning to do something, but maybe we can make that also a little bit more explicit, just to have an idea of who is in the process, and we can work with those countries also moving forward. Great, thank you so much. Anybody else? Maybe some of the colleagues who have provided some of the comments. Egil.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I just wanted to add one small comment that we somehow have to think about incentives to fill in this survey, because it's really sometimes difficult to get answers. And if we won't receive the full picture, enough answers, and not see a full picture, that would be, I think, a bad thing, right? So I'm not sure, but somehow maybe we also can speak about incentives that countries will fill in questionnaire.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And indeed, even in the last meeting that we held, I think everybody was saying what is really important is to make sure that countries do respond to this survey. So the idea of making it as simple as possible, but then as comprehensive also as possible, is one of the ways to make the countries respond. But there might be some additional incentives that can be used. And if anybody has any specific ideas or unspecific ideas, any ideas on how we can incentivize more responses from the countries, we are ready to listen to that as well. Thank you for that. Rahul, yes, please.
Thanks, Anna, and Happy New Year to all of you. Excellent points. One of the questions and comments actually revolves around this need for getting responses from the national focal point. So we have a series of questions, and sometimes for whatever XYZ reasons, the focal points are not exactly in a position to give the responses immediately because there are certain bottlenecks. So they would be waiting for, internal communications to go through, or for whatever reason, sometimes there's delay on their part to provide responses. It's a similar issue that we also face here at ITU when we compile all the ICT indicators, which is supposed to come from, various regulatory and Ministry of Communication agencies. So I was just wondering if there's any way to handhold them and support them in terms of getting information. So some of ways in which we could support them would be, let's say, like secondary information, which is already available from public websites. Like some of the governments, they have open data initiatives in the policy statements, and a lot of the initiatives are there up online. But then again, we run a risk of providing information that may, cause bias to them, whatever. So yeah, just wondering, to what extent is it feasible or practical to complement this input of the survey from the focal points with secondary research that we could also provide them, that, hey, by the way, in case you didn't know, your government has open data policy statements, and these XYZ are the new initiatives, which aligns well with question number 5, 6, and 7. So because just by doing this, we are in a position to support them. And yeah, sometimes it could be inefficiencies, or just like an individual is not overwhelmed with too many questions. So what else can we do to give because I can see that the general sentiment here is that, okay, let's keep the survey simple, but then it has unintended consequences, right? In order to keep the survey simple, we think it's simple, but then we are not really being able to empathize from the point of view of the person on the other side who has to take care of all these 50, 60 odd questions and compile them, and talking to, I don't know, 50 different people. It's what can we actually do for them to make it easy? Now, this is, again, I don't have solution. It's just I'm flagging this, and you know, like, yeah, thanks.
No, that's great, Raul. And indeed, I mean, the second part of our discussions today is going a little bit in that direction. And this is what Ezra was saying, you know, we need several parts in this monitoring of open science, including the monitoring of the implementation of the recommendation. And so this is really survey to the member states. But indeed, the idea would be that we do collect some data from the databases that are already available. And that could also be useful for the member states while they are filling in this survey. Now, Ferrister will be talking more about this in the second part of our discussions. But the idea would also be, for example, that in November this year, we would like to publish a first Open Science Outlook that would look into some of the data that already exists, including existing policies, you know, percentage of open access, open data available, engagement, citizen science projects, etc. Some of these data that we can already have from reliable sources, and that would indeed help member states then when they have to report to the survey that we will be sending out. But I am sure that there are maybe some other ways of assisting and helping and getting some other information in addition to what will be collected through the survey. And again, very happy to and open to suggestions on this particular item as well. Gareth O'Neill, I have your hand next.
Yes, I'd see if you can hear me as well.
Yeah, excellent.
Hi, so Gareth O'Neill, I'm from Technopolis Group. I'm working on a monitoring tool called the EOSC Observatory. I think this may have been raised somewhat in the first meeting. And this tool specifically working together with the EOSC steering board. I see Volker Beckman, who's co-chair of the steering board, also on the call here. So working closely with the EOSC steering board and the commission, we are working on an annual survey called National Contributions to EOSC, which also includes open science, which is quite extensive in the questions that have already been asked in a first survey run and published online in the tool last year, but we will now be also running these annual surveys with extensive questions across multiple categories like publications, data, infrastructure, software, services, assessment, skills and training, citizen science, and so forth. So what I'm wondering, and I'm not looking to answer that now, is to what extent there is an overlap in the questions that are being asked, because I actually do see some overlap, such as on national policies on some of these topics, or other data sources, let's say, or financial streams, perhaps. So I'm wondering, to what extent should there be an overlap, or should there be some form of separation? And to what extent should there even be some form of interoperability of the data or sharing of the data across the different surveys and or different tools? So maybe that's a discussion for the future. Perhaps Volker wants to add to that, but it's just a kind of a flag from our side that I see overlap in some of the questions here. And I'm just wondering to what extent we should have overlap, or should there be more overlap or less, and how to share that data so that we're not asking the same people the same questions.
Great, thank you very much for that. And this idea of synergies with other surveys is something that we're really keen on, and we know that countries want to use that as much as possible. So I see Volker, your hand is up. Please go ahead. I think you want to add to this as well. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks for this question, and thanks, Gareth, for pointing this out. There was also the comment by Thomas Neidenmark of the European Commission in the chat with the link to our survey. So I think overlap is not at all a problem,
No.
As long as we can exchange the data easily. So we are fully open of disclosing all the answers we get on our survey. And we are also, as this is a living survey, which we do once a year, but we are also open for adjusting parts of the survey in the next installment and for the next year in order to make it more compatible. So I think that would be great if we could see where we can help each other out in order to avoid asking the same question to some colleagues and in some countries from two different sides. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. And we really do want to have a look, and we did already have a look at what you have done for your surveys. It's very important that we use the information that countries are already filling in. So we'll definitely be in touch and make sure that they can indeed use it as much as possible for the two reportings. I see Jaren Bosman. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi, thank you, Anna, and hi all. Jeroen Bosman from Utrecht University Library in the Netherlands. Maybe it's beyond the scope of this monitoring exercise, but I wonder whether it would be feasible and useful to, next to the planned surveys, also have a survey just of the researchers. Yeah. So as a sort of reality check on whether any policies are really in reality trickling down and changing behavior. But also, of course, that can be grassroots development of open science practices as well. So of course, that's not easy to do if you want to do that globally, or if you want to collect it from regional or national surveys and collect the data, etc. But I think it's well worth having, and we do not have such a thing currently.
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, in what Ezra presented, and again, this builds on what was discussed at the last meeting, this survey to researchers, the global survey to researchers, would be like the third element of this more complex monitoring framework, because we kind of need, in a way, the top-down and the bottom-up responses to, as you say, also check on what is the reality then of these policies and how does that impact the different researchers. And it is something to think about. We have not yet started the reflection, but I see that Ismail is here, and I know that him and his group in our new UNESCO chair, they have given it a little bit of thought. Ismail, if there is anything you would like to share on this particular topic or on others with regards to the monitoring framework, that would be great. But I do see that there is need to also go kind of beyond, if you wish, member state responses, and to engage in surveys with researchers. Another thing which might be of interest in the future, while we are thinking about such global survey of researchers, is what some of the colleagues are already doing in terms of looking into how many researchers really are doing open access, sharing their data. There is more and more smaller surveys for smaller communities to try to understand. I know PLOS has been doing something similar. There is obviously a need, and we will have to try to understand what would be the best way to collect that information as well at that level as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Ismail.
Hi, well, thanks for mentioning this. So as Ingeborg Meyer has pointed out now in the chat, there is the project Supermori, which in terms of RRI has carried out surveys to funding agencies, to performing organizations, and is carrying it out now. It's finishing now the survey to respondents. And some of the aspects of RRI, for example, on ethics, on citizen science, overlap with open science. So there's possibility of learning from what was successful and less successful of these surveys. And we'll be very glad to interact. Ingeborg is the key person here.
Great. Is maybe he joining the call?
Yes, Ingeborg?
Yes, hi everyone.
Sorry, apologies. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I should put she, her.
I wasn't sure from the name. Apologies.
No, yeah. Of course, I understand. Yes, this project has been carrying out the researchers survey, which was actually a recurrent activity, because the previous survey was done, I think, in 2016, which already focused on open science as a general concept. This one is much more extensive, also looking at citizen science and public engagement. It is actually geared at research performing organizations in Europe that are part of the RPO study as well, the Research Performing Organization endeavor, which includes 144 universities and research institutes and higher education institutions across the whole of Europe. So it doesn't have a global scope in that sense. This was done mainly to look at, it was mainly desk research with a clear instruction template carried out by country correspondents, so as to look at local languages as well. It has been identifying policies and strategies, including action plans on these topics of open science, citizen science, public engagement, but also ethics and equality, and the general and open access and all those sort of things that are part of the RRI keys as they were defined by the European Commission. Then we have also included a survey to research funding organizations across Europe, one usually two per country. So we have in total 55 responses. Usually one of the two is public, the other one is more charity or another type of institute. And here it is also focusing on the policies and the action plans, but it was supported by a set of interviews which are being coded or have been coded already. In terms of results, I think the data are they were more than yes and no. They were, in a sense, coded ordinal from 1 to 5, but not on agree or many or less, but from very practical to inspirational. So as to see how much of these things are in planning or just thought of, and when it's more practical, then the implementation is going on already. So these results are presented in the next monitoring report, which will be, I think, ready by the end of this year, because that is when Supermodi ends, and that will then include also the analysis of the 3,500 researchers that have responded to the survey. Now, I have downloaded from our cloud the interview guides and the plans of how this has been done. I'll have to ask for clearance from our coordinator. And I also have a sort of functioning link that you can use to look at the researcher survey, which is so that you can follow the line of questioning in the survey. So that material is available, and it would be very much also in the interest of the Supermori project to team up with the UNESCO working group, so that we can benefit from each other, and that it has a clear landing or a hook or a place where this material can be taken further, because as you all know, with these projects, they tend to end at some point.
No, this is very good. And I think, again, for the next discussion that we will have on possible surveys to researchers, and I saw Mega's posting also in the chat from the International Science Council. And Mega, if you wish, you can definitely jump in. It is definitely something that we would love to do with the ISE, because of course you have a more direct reach to the researchers and scientists themselves. So if we can internationalize what has been done by the MORI project and also what other things that we could bring in, I think that would be a very interesting next step as well. Mega, did you want to jump in here?
Not really, and I just think it's something that we should discuss when the idea is ripe, and I'll think about if there's opportunities in the near future to develop this.
Yeah, because I mean, ISC was very, very useful when we were developing the recommendation on open science, precisely to reach out to researchers and scientists so that we get feedback from the ground on what should be in our recommendation. So I think it would be nice to build on that and go a little bit further as well. But that's a good idea.
Yeah, we're actually just
sorry. Sorry, Mega, you are on mute.
Sorry, I think I keep getting muted by the host. But we're doing a regional level consultations at the moment, so we are already digging down, and so that would give us a better idea of what's the best way to reach out to individual scientists to really test what you're learning from your national surveys.
Excellent, excellent. That's a very good point, and I'm very much looking forward to looking into these issues as well. Great. Any other comment on the survey, how we can make it better? I also know that there are some representatives of our member states here. If you wish to take the floor at this point or later on, no problem at all. It would be good to get some feedback from the member states on how this could look like. Yes, Sarita. Sarita, Donti, I see your hand. Maybe just if you could unmute yourself.
Yeah, here.
Yes,
yeah,
there we go.
here.
Perfect.
Yeah, when it comes to open science policies and open science infrastructures, I think we can focus more on creative approach, and also we need to make sure that science as social good and global good is the need of the hour. Like whenever we go for inclusive innovations, and also when we are focusing on creating new policies and also new infrastructures, so it's more like a creative approach with responsible innovation that might be more useful. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Sunita. Hannah, I see your hand is up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes. Maybe can you please share your screen with questions? Maybe it would be better for me to comment
with all the different questions. The survey.
Yes, just to see the text of the survey.
Okay,
it would be more convenient.
Yes.
Maybe question 3.4 regarding infrastructure classification. For example, the third bullet point, you have open science platforms and repositories. In my opinion, maybe they can be separated because they're different things. And the meaning of open science platforms can be clarified. I think you probably mean such kind of search portals, metadata aggregators, which harvest outputs metadata from different sources and provides them in one place. So the meaning can be clarified a bit. And probably this classification, I understand it's based on the recommendation provisions, but maybe some items can be missed, something like open access platforms, publishing platforms like Open Research Europe. So as an option, you can just add at the end other, and please specify just not closed list.
Great.
And question, for example, 5.3. It's in the last part. Yes. For me, it's a bit quite a broad question, and the part promote and recognize open science a bit overlap with previous questions. For example, regarding promote, in previous questions you have like, do you have some policies that promote open science? So it's kind of promotion. And recognition, for example, is related to question 5.1. Which is recognition of open science practices as part of research evaluation, research assessment procedures. So either I think it's just like to leave in this question reward, or clarify what do you mean in this case by promote and recognize.
Yeah, great. Very
yeah, I mean, I have other comments, but I just like highlighted a few of them.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you also for sending us the comments in writing. And again, I would like to invite everybody, we still have time. We would love to get your comments, additional comments in writing as well. Thanks, Hannah. These are very good comments. We'll have a look at that. Might come back to you to see how we can best do this list of the different infrastructures, and then giving people indeed option to add some other points if they so wish, and if we have forgotten something as well. And on the rewards, that's you're absolutely right. We were just looking at those questions and agree that we should focus more on rewards in that particular question, because the evaluations, assessments, and policies as incentives have already been taken up in some other questions. Is there anybody else who would like to take the floor at this stage for the... Yes, Cécile.
Hi all, Happy New Year.
Hello, Happy New Year to you too.
I was wondering if in the monitoring framework it couldn't be interesting, either for national or international feedback, to ask them what kind of services or cross-professional services was leading or acting for implementing the recommendation. I'm asking this because we have been answering in December, if my memory is good, for the OER's recommendation implementation. And one of the main questions we had is to make sure at the state level that we provide a full or a comprehensive answer. We had to identify and make sure that we identified all services that were involved in implementing the recommendation. So maybe that can be interesting to put there by design, and that could help also UNESCO to highlight the main actors, for example, in training or for research infrastructure, interoperability, facilitating, you know what I mean? It could be something for the analysis, and it could be helpful for the respondent. Thank you.
Yeah, very good indeed. We had it in some questions when we are asking, for example, what are the appropriate ministries, institutions that have been involved in the implementation of the recommendation, but we asked it in a broad sense, not more specifically, but it is something that we can try to see how to integrate in the questionnaire, because it is true that it would be good to have an idea of who the actors are that are actually involved in the implementation at the national level. So that's a very good suggestion.
That's a collaborative dynamic.
Yeah.
So this is why it could be so interesting for open science to see how people operate, and not only what kind of programs were put into place. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very well noted. Any other comments? Sarita, I still have your hand, but I wonder if that's the hand from before, or do you have something to add?
Nothing. I just put it like that.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Anyways, Happy New Year, Anna.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to say something? I didn't really follow the chat, so I'm also asking my colleagues if they have seen any specific questions in the chat or anything that we can still raise in this part of the... Yes, Cameron, please. Hello, thanks for joining.
Hi, Anna, how are you? Nice to see everyone. So I have a relatively general question, and forgive me if I'm expressing any ignorance on this matter, but at least as far as it comes to KPIs and monitoring, I'm not super familiar with the space. But so it seems here that what you're really trying to do with the survey is trying to measure the uptake of the recommendation across member states, which I think is great, and hopefully that will result in, hopefully what you'll learn is that there's been some movement there. Our interest at CERN in particular, having just introduced our own open science policy this year, is to try and see if we can come up with a monitoring framework to measure the progress of open science within our institution. And I see that is kind of maybe like a secondary step beyond this one. But I do think they're kind of interrelated in one way. I guess my principal concern is that obviously there are some current excellent initiatives going on, surveys that are undertaken. One of the reasons why I asked Gareth a question about the EOSC survey was that we had to respond to one earlier this year, and in filling out their survey, which was specifically on KPIs, we realized that there was a lot of things that they had thought of that we weren't measuring ourselves and that maybe we should start doing. And so that just made me think that, you know, particularly given the role that UNESCO is playing in advancing open science policies and practices, and hopefully ultimately towards the measurement of their progress, that there may be an opportunity to do some kind of coordination of some of these existing practices around surveys and measuring, maybe kind of agreeing on a standard or global set of KPIs that institutions or countries might be measuring, and ways in which to do it, so that moving forward, you know, over the next few years, when, you know, we're having a conversation with the French or with Germany, and we're talking about, you know, the uptake of open data or the number of data sets released, that we're comparing apples to apples, so that we're all kind of speaking in a common vocabulary rather than, you know, potentially measuring the same things but doing it in different ways, if you see what I mean. And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for UNESCO to, at some point, maybe help mediate some of this process.
Thank you again. Thanks very much, Cameron. And that's kind of an introduction to the second part of the discussions that we will be having. Looking into some of the again, we're not saying for the moment that but it's a good idea looking into some of the kind of joint common global KPIs that could be used and that we then use across when we do reporting. You will see Ferrester will be presenting it in a couple of minutes. It's kind of where we are going, trying to understand what is already there, what are the databases that have the data, where we don't have data, and then we would encourage maybe member states and other actors to provide their data in those specific data sources or databases so that we can all use them to be able to report on some of these more let's say specific ways in which we could measure the impact then of our policies, recommendations, etc. And definitely we see the need for that because it's still very scattered and people are still kind of reporting in all kinds of different ways, using different sources depending on what kind of aspects they would like to emphasize or not. which makes also sometimes the comparison between different countries or actors or practices a little bit different and then difficult. Again, I think that the European Commission has done a lot already in that way, and there's a lot to build on that, but we also have to make sure that we have global sets of data that we can also use for that. Gareth, yes, did you want to continue? Yeah, add, please.
Yeah, if I can respond briefly to Cameron as well, in relation to his question, and I partially, I guess, responded in the chat. Just to separate these things, Cameron, so for the EOSC Association, and specifically now I talk about the co-programmed European EOSC partnership, there are these two surveys. The first one is on the additional activities plan, so the activities that the members of the EOSC Association do towards EOSC and open science that contribute to the EOSC partnership, where they have an agreement, of course, in place with the European Commission. And then also the KPI survey, the one you refer to, where the members of the EOSC Association, typically the institutions in the countries, but of course there are institutions like CERN, which extend beyond the countries, also as members of the EOSC Association. And there they report on how their activities contribute directly to the specified agreed KPIs in the EOSC partnership. And that is within the agreement of the partnership, where the members of the association will contribute minimally 500 million euros in kind contributions to EOSC within the framework of Horizon Europe, and the Commission will match that to the tune of 450 million in calls. So that's at institutional / EOSC association member level. Now the EOSC steering board, which speaks then for the member states and associated countries of Europe who are attached to Horizon Europe, their mandate, of course, is at the national level. They have this survey, which I referred to, which looks slightly broader than the EOSC association surveys, broader because it's not just focused on the EOSC partnership, but beyond. And in that sense, there is overlap, both in who has to answer the surveys, because often ministries will delegate this to particular organizations in the country or the same people in some cases. And there may also be overlap in content questions and in funding, where the national government may, of course, say that we are spending X on EOSC and open science. And then, of course, that funding trickles down to RPOs and RFOs who could be a member of the EOSC association. So to make sure that we are trying to align, we already have bi-weekly meetings within the scope of the EOSC Future project with both the EOSC association and the EOSC steering board, with the EC as part of the EOSC steering board, to align the surveys to make sure that we're not asking too many questions or the same questions, and which questions are critical for which partner, let's say. On top of that, we have also, for instance, taken input from the association into account in our surveys and vice versa. And we are also now in discussion with the association, and have been since the start of the project, on to what extent the association surveys could be involved or integrated or shared with the EOSC steering board surveys, whether that's through the EOSC observatory or not. But in any case, at least from the side of the EOSC steering board surveys, that data every year will be made public. The surveys will be made public, and analysis of the data will also be made public. So what's in there now at the moment in the observatory and in the Zenodo link I shared was the first year's survey. The first year's data set is there, and the analysis and all the relevant documents if you really want to know a bit more. So this is just to say that there is a separation there at level, whether that's institutional EOSC association, EOSC partnership level versus the member state level from the EOSC steering board, and that they are doing their best to align both the surveys, the timing, the content, and so forth.
Okay, that's great, very good. We will definitely have a closer look into everything that you've been doing, because I really feel like you are at the next level. I think one of the issues that we are facing at the global level, again, is that we have countries, actors, practices that are at different stage of maturity. And yet we really want to understand who is doing what, to what extent, what are some of innovations that maybe some other countries are bringing on board. So I think on our side, what will be the biggest challenge is really to get a global overview of what open science means, how is it done, knowing that, again, countries are not starting from the same starting points and don't have the same amount of investment, whether it's in open science or in science in general. But talking about that, I really do also like the comments in the chat about a multilingual glossary for open science lingo, language. I think it's something that we could indeed do, and also Ezra was chatting, that we could do to also facilitate, because that's also part of facilitating uptake of these recommendations or of these open science practices, is just to be able to explain a little bit more in plainer words what that means. And we can have a look, thanks Joe, for already some of the glossaries that exist, and maybe try to see how we can facilitate their dissemination and maybe the translation in different languages, etc. So that's also a very good suggestion. So thank you all very much for that. We'll take note and we'll try to follow up on that as well. Great. So I think it's 3:15. We are right on time. I see already lots of questions going in the way of, what specific data sources we have, what can we measure, how can the KPIs look like. So maybe at this point, I would turn it to Ferishte, who will be making the presentation, the next presentation. Ferry, if you want to take the floor.
Thank you, Anna, and hi, everyone. Is my screen properly shared?
Perfect.
Yes, great. So I think it's still early enough to say Happy New Year to everyone, and thanks for joining today, and thanks for your inputs. So as the second part of the monitoring framework, as it was discussed in our last meeting, we also need to do output analysis based on existing inclusive global scientific scholarly databases. I will just flash back to our discussions of the first meeting shortly. We discussed a few guiding principles for the monitoring framework, and as one of the provisions of the recommendation, it was recommended that whenever possible, we use open, non-proprietary, and transparent infrastructures for getting information to the monitoring framework. We should also consider, as it was discussed earlier, the synergies and overlaps between the relevant UNESCO recommendation and also other normative instruments. For example, the UNESCO recommendation on science and scientific researchers, or the open educational resource recommendation. There are also available relevant indicators and data sources, for example, in the GoSwim platform of UNESCO, or for UN SDG indicators and other regional indicators that we can use, regional and global indicators that we can use and extend. We can also make this process a bit more efficient by already consulting the national focal points and actors to identify what kind of data is already collected and can be collected at the national level. So we expect that from the survey for member states that Anna presented, at least for the first editions, we will receive more qualitative information on the practices of open science. To complete this with a more quantitative picture of the state of open science and practices, open science practices and outputs, it would be good to find what are the existing information and data. For that, we can ask three main questions. The first one is, what aspects of open science, as identified in the recommendation, can be quantified? Then for each of them, we need to identify indicators and find the relevant data sources that are most reliable, complete, and, as it was mentioned, comparable between the nations, disciplines, or for institutes. So the first question, what aspects of open science can be quantified? We think that ideally we can measure the outputs of the open scientific knowledge outputs, for example, from the open access publications, data, educational resources, open source software and codes, and open hardwares. And from the other pillars, we also expect that we can quantify the number of open science infrastructures, Also open engagement of societal actors to some extent. Open dialogue with other knowledge systems, like indigenous knowledge systems, can be a bit less straightforward, but we can think about this together. Then open science policy instruments, again, measurable. Open science funding, it can be measurable. And open science incentive and rewards, a bit challenging, but still measurable. And the use of open science licenses. Then we have thought for these aspects, we have thought about the existing indicators, and we also checked some of the resources, for example, the Open Science Monitor methodology that was an input for the EU Commission to develop their monitoring. And we build upon that this preliminary table of questions or indicators for each of the aspects, and some of the existing data sources, and of course to fine-tune the questions and find the most relevant data sources, we would need your input. So I will just go very fast through some of these questions. For open access publications, we can look at the percentage of open access publications and sort them based on discipline, language, countries, and publication types. There are some resources like Dimensions, the Scopus, Web of Science. We still need to discuss what are the most relevant ones for like coverage of different languages and geographies. For the number of open science journals, we can refer to the Directory of Open Access Journals. But then the issue is, for example, that we need to find a way or see if we can exclude the predatory journals. We can also look at the number of open access repositories, again, and their distribution geographically and based on disciplines from Open Door, Directory of Open Access repositories. We can look at the number, percentage, geographical distribution of funder, publishers, and institutions' open access policies. For example, Sherpa provides this information for the Sherpa Juliet provides this information for funders, and Sherpa Romeo provides this for publishers. For open data, we can look at the number of open data repositories. We can look at the percentage of open access papers which are published with open or better fair data. We can look at number and size of open data sets. There are some repositories and platforms that people can share their scientific data, but some of them like Zenoda and Figshare, they have a limited size of the files that can be shared. So we need to see if we can find a better way to include bigger file data sets. Then we can look at the percentage and distribution of researchers who share open data. As it was mentioned, there are surveys of researchers for this kind of information, but we haven't included the surveys in this table because they are based on voluntary inputs from the researchers, and probably they are not the most complete one. But we also understand that for some of these indicators, we may not have completely global information. So we can take samples or from different disciplines. We can look how in like smaller areas this is practiced. Then for open source software and codes, we can also look at the number of code projects that have a DOI, for example, in Code Meta, or number of open source softwares or codes that are shared on platforms like GitHub, Base, Zenodo. The thing is, we haven't figured out yet if we can have access to the data, but we think it's possible also to ask a lot of these repositories and services to provide the data that we need at this stage, and then in a later stage to make it available for everyone to use. We can look at the number and percentage of open source software citations. Then in the open hardwares, we can look at the number of projects and designs that are provided on open hardware repositories, the number of projects that use some of the open hardware licenses, for example, CERN open hardware license or other existing ones. Then we can look at also the number of open hardware repositories and their distribution. For citizen science, we think we can look at the number of distribution of citizen science projects on platforms like SciStarter or Zooniverse, or some other more inclusive ones. Number of participation of citizen science, number of participants in citizen science projects, again, is something that we can get from SciStarter, or they can provide it to us. Funding for citizen science projects, we think, is again an interesting measure to look at. Number and distribution of scientific projects funding through crowdfunding, for example, there are platforms for that. Then for OS fundings, I mean, that when we move toward the end of the list, it's a bit more difficult because there is less data available, or at least we could find less data available. So these indicators need to be better fine-tuned. So for funding, we can look at the national investments in open science knowledge, different aspects of that, from open access publishing, data, and the rest. We can look at the investment in open science infrastructures. We can look at the expenditure at the national level for scholarly publication and subscription and compare open access in the whole publication system. We can look at the financial benefits or estimate of financial benefits of practicing open science. For incentives, again, at the moment we have, for example, the number of signatories of DORA, or soon I guess we will have the number of signatories of the new agreement on reforming research assessment. But then the issue is this really a good indicator of institutes or funders having or practicing incentives for open science, or can we think about something better? We can also look at the use of and distribution of use of open science licenses in the last years. So this is the very preliminary table that we have. And as I said, we would really appreciate your inputs today during the meeting and also in the days after the meeting on this. Thanks. I think I can hand over to Tiffany to guide the discussion on this. Thank you, Tiffany.
Thanks so much, Ferry. And again, this is my chance to greet everyone. So wonderful to see many familiar names and faces. Let's please jump right in. I see that we already have some hands up. We're very interested to hear from you. Again, as you speak today, as you use the chat box today, or as you can send us messages by email. We very much want to hear from the experts within this working group, what we can measure, what we should be measuring, and that important third question, which is where there is something that's important to assess about open science and the implementation of the recommendation, which are two different things, but where there's something to assess, but where there is no validated data set or database or set of information that functions at the national, regional, and global level that is representative of the real work that's going on. We should be clear as a working group, we should be able to provide clarity about what is needed to make progress in the monitoring of open science and of the recommendation. We should be able to show what is there, but also what is not there and what is needed. So we're very keen to hear your inputs. I see that Vincent already has his hand up, so please hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation, Fereshte. This is really interesting. I have a couple of comments. The first thing, I made it in the chat, but I think it's crucial that we use open tools for many reasons. One of them is, again, the coherence, but also the open tools are more open also from a coverage point of view. There is no way that we should use the typical for-profit citation analysis, because in most of the cases, they actually don't cover science in the South. They cover only science that's published in English. And so if we want something global, we will really need to use something that has this global coverage. The second comment relates more to the diversity of indicators and of concepts that we're trying to measure here. There are some of them that are actually quite standard, for which we have a good understanding of the concept itself of, let's say, open access versus open science from a, let's say, participation of society and stuff like that. So these things are a bit more difficult to define and also more difficult to measure. So my point here is that we won't be able to do everything at the same time. there are some indicators where we actually need to focus more on the data sources, but we know where we're going with that. There's some others for which there's conceptual work that has to be done in order to think about what should be the indicator. So I think it should be iterative. We'll be able to monitor some aspects of open science very shortly. There's some others that I believe are on more of a 5 to 10 year window. Maybe 10 years too much, but again, maybe I'm not so wrong on that. So thank you.
Thank you, indeed. And we agree about the use of stages, and this should evolve over time. It's exciting to me that there are lots of tools available now that will eventually give us this data. For example, as we see increasing adoption of persistent identifiers for organizations or for grants, we can start tracking how money is flowing or how organizations are involved in open science over time. But you're right that we don't have a full and complete data set immediately available. Can I ask, there's a wonderful conversation going on in the chat. I would welcome anyone who's mentioned as part of that conversation in the chat to take the floor now, or anyone else who has a comment either on the existing indicators or the data sources that Fereshteh has presented to us. I see Ismail's hand, please. Thank you.
Hi. Regarding citizen science, I'm very skeptical, honestly, that you can classify projects into those which are citizen science and those which are not. And I think there would be massive under-reporting of many projects in many countries. So I would be very cautious in relation to citizen science. Also because I think rather than thinking projects that are citizen science and those which are not citizen science, we should consider whether projects in general take into account the stakeholders. And for this, I am afraid we would need to rely on surveys to researchers, as was suggested before.
It's a great point. Thank you. I'll pass immediately to Gareth. Go ahead.
Just a quick follow-on to Ishmael. In the survey I spoke about going to the EO steering board, one of the components of monitoring policies and practices is on what we call engagement, which is basically for now citizen science. And in there, we ask questions on, do you have a policy on citizen science? Are you monitoring it? Do you have a financial strategy? How much are you spending on this? Do you have policies at RPOs and RFOs? If so, how many? And one of the questions we have there is on what is the number of projects with a citizen science dimension in your country? Now, we know that this is a problematic question, and we're not sure what we're going to get back, but we wanted to start somewhere. So this question will be asked in the coming survey, which will be published tomorrow, we expect. So we want to see what happens then over the next few months when the member states fill this in, what they come back with. We originally were going to just ask citizen science projects, but of course, as you note, it's not that simple to just define what is a citizen science or what is not. So at least from the perspective of the governments or maybe the funders, which of those projects or calls do you know specifically requested citizen science or specifically focus on citizen science or involve citizen science? But what that actually gives us, we won't probably know until next year. So that's just to note that that's happening right now as we speak, and hopefully we'll learn a bit more on how to refine that question.
Thank you. Yes, we've been eagerly anticipating the citizen science track end of project results, basically, where they've spent a few years trying to analyze the state of citizen science within the European region and look at how it can be monitored. And I think they found a lot more complexity than would lend itself to a simple survey response. I'm wondering if Susanna is also on the call, because as we continue this conversation around engagement, she had an interesting perspective from Malaysia, where the government, because the government is the main source of research funding, one of the things that they can do is track which projects have been conducted with a partner from the private sector. And so there's a measurable way to say, look, these are straight academic projects versus these are ones that have this kind of public-private partnership, and they're using that as a metric of engagement as well. Something for us to keep in mind. I see Raul's hand. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Tiffany. Happy New Year. I think it's linked very closely to what another intervention was recently, which was on, I think it was Vincent who mentioned about the need for using the open science tools. And just to highlight on that, because I received an interesting comment from some of the people that I was working with when reaching out to them for an open science week for next year at the EPFL, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And that was done, the whole coordination was done using Google Docs, which is not open. So some fingers were pointed to the fact that, you're using closed tools for endorsing open science projects. And it may be perceived as an ad hominem attack, the argument itself, like how can you, so yeah, just to kind of flag that, like the fact that we are talking on Zoom and not an open platform, it is a red flag in some sense. And so is like whatever survey instruments that shall be used, which generally typically would be a commercially available survey instrument. So yeah, I don't know where we are headed from the point of view of the operational aspects of using science, open science tools, but that could definitely be something that it's usual suspect, right? People generally, they tend to attack on that front, even if it's not the most relevant topic to really discuss. But yeah, just to flag that, just in case if in the future some others they may question this. Thanks.
Sure, and I think we're all working out loud in this space and making more progress there. I'll let Anna go ahead to respond to that as well.
It was to that, in the sense that, yes, I think it is important to use open tools for our open science monitoring. I think that was in one of FAIRY's first principles, and it's something that we really have to do as much as possible and promote as much as possible. So it's great to also receive some of the additional databases here in the chat, which I suppose are all open access as well. But my question was also with regard to this conversation about citizen science, the difficulty of measuring it and looking into it. But these two platforms or data sources around citizen science that we have now, SciStarter and Zooniverse, I just wanted to hear a little bit from the members of the group. How do they feel about those platforms? What are their strengths, weaknesses? Are those platforms that we could be looking at, or they're not there yet and it's better not to engage in doing the analysis throughout those platforms? That was just my question for the members.
Thanks, Anna, and I'll drop those links into the chat for everyone who might not be familiar with them. I see Esther's hand. Please go ahead.
Thanks. It's not directly related to Anna's question, but related to the difficulty of measuring things. So I've been trying to see how we can measure open research outputs at the faculty level. I'm a data steward at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And I am very much struggling with how do we measure this, because open access publications are the most straightforward, because you generally know how many publications there are and how many of them are open. But the same cannot be said for data sets and open software projects, for example. Not every publication necessarily has an underlying data set. So how do we measure that? And I am also a bit concerned about looking about assessing data sets based on their data size, because the size of data sets is very much dependent on the discipline that people are working in. And also, if we look at size, for example, it can be a very easy game to play, to just upload very large data sets. And I also don't think that that's a great idea in terms of sustainability. So I really don't have an answer, but I don't think it's as simple as looking at the quantity of these things.
Indeed, that's a wonderful point. Thank you. We do see some differences. For example, some people are sharing, as you say, data sets versus sets of data sets or individual data points, and we can't measure, the percentage of open data in that way without running into exactly the problems that you mentioned, either prioritizing certain disciplines over others or basically prioritizing data dumping, if you will. Ferry perhaps has some more comments to make on that because you did just look at those metrics. I think we have some examples that we can build on. For example, the state of open data is a survey that has been conducted for several years now, looking at this, looking at open government data, looking at other kinds of data outside of research data, which is going to be our focus under the recommendation. And there's also ways to look at the use of persistent data identifiers as linked to either closed or open access publications that might also help us indicate that not just the existence of data, but how it's being used or not, or incorporated into the rest of scientific output and scientific practice. But I agree, I think we have a lot of work to do, a deeper conversation to have about the appropriate ways to measure the openness of data as it links to and as it comes from other aspects of scientific practice. Welcome any other comments on that regard, or Ferry, did you want to drop a few lines about the open data resources that you measured, or the options that we have for measuring that at the regional level?
Point that Esther mentioned about the size, I totally agree. It's more like at this stage we are looking at the measurables, and then we need to fine tune them. And I also agree completely that not just for data, for the whole monitoring, we also need to be careful to encourage the sustainable practice of open science, both in continuity and also like environmental sustainableness of that. I totally agree.
Thank you. And I think this one in particular, it brings up the point that Ezra made in the beginning, and I think has been made in every part of today's call, that there's a separation between monitoring open science and monitoring the implementation of the recommendation, and we need to keep those distinctions in mind. And there's a difference between tracking what's already available and easy to measure, easy to turn into numbers, versus tracking the actual progress that's being made in open science. And what can be measured and can be sort of disaggregated at national level is sometimes different from what we can get at regional or at global level. And we face this challenge where those who are required, in a sense, to report under the recommendation are member states. It's happening at national level. But that needs to be placed within the regional and global picture. So when it comes to something like open data, where it's often there's a data policy that's put forward at the institutional level, institutions are keeping track of the data that they hold, and we might be able to get the percentage of that is open. How can we translate between the institutional processes and what's happening at national level and use that to get a picture at regional and global level that not only is representative of what's actually happening, but that we can turn into the kind of action and kind of support that's needed to make progress, to help everyone around the world make progress on open science. That, of course, that conversation is not restricted to open data alone. We see this in other aspects of open science, but we welcome your inputs on that kind of translation from institutional, national, regional, and global into action for the next phases. I don't see any hands right at the moment, but I know, again, there's been some wonderful conversation in the chat. I wonder if Joe Haveman might like to make a few points here. You've been giving us some wonderful resources and comments in the chat. Thank you.
Sorry I had anyways, don't mind the bruise on my eye. It's a long story, and it's not domestic violence. Well, in a way it is. I had a meeting with my dog accident. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know where to start. I think I think the most important points I mentioned were, yeah, let's just avoid to trigger another gaming of metrics by trying to measure, but we are all aware of that. And I just wonder if you've already found an approach to avoid that from happening. It's probably unavoidable to some extent, but as also these cohorts with the working groups tend to be underrepresented, but even though more diverse than other cohorts that I personally tend. But yeah, so it's relatively better when it comes to global representation of these cohorts facilitated by you guys. Thanks for that. But still not anywhere near the actual representation on the globe when it comes to science engagement or where we want it to be. And as was pointed out in the chat and also in other working groups. And so yeah, just to be fully cautious and aware of that fact that we don't want to avoid any regaming of the matrices. But other than that, I don't know. There's a few things that I'm very passionate about, as some of you know now, and I don't know where to start and where to end at this point. But thanks for the opportunity. Anything in particular you wanted me to address?
This is great. Yeah, no, I wanted to make sure that everyone knew what you were working on. And thank you for sharing, for example, the analysis that you did about the openness of open science tools, which I think is important for us to keep in mind, particularly when considering that global perspective.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
The phone was ringing and that, oh, no, I can't. I rewrite, sorry.
No problem. Sure. Yeah, yeah, I'm seeing a request from Roll. Yes, we'll link to the study that Joe and Louise did to analyze the openness of open science tools, which include a whole bunch of different sorts of tools and infrastructure. This is a conversation we're having in our infrastructure working group as well, where there are materials and tools that are freely accessible, but that may come from, they may require a sign up or may come from a commercial partner, but still are part of the way that people are working openly as they look to ways to use and share information. You mentioned also, for example, the lens, and I think I should point out that the resources that FAIRY has pointed out to us as data sources for national, regional, and global information, we recognize that it's not everything out there. There are multiple sources for some of these topics, and there's very few or nothing for other aspects of open science. And our job is to distinguish the best of, and to, again, make clear where gaps exist and what can be done to address those gaps. For example, there's far more work that's been done. There's far more data sources for something like open access publications than there are for tracking what's happening in open hardware, whether it's certifications or availability of hardware designs, for example. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that bibliographic searching isn't the same as necessarily bibliometric analyses. When we're looking at global scientific output, regional and national scientific output, from the very beginning, when we make a decision about which data source to use, we are, because the different data sets are not directly comparable, just because of the data processing and the sourcing that they have, we are committing ourselves along a pathway. We want to track and ensure that this process is going to serve us over the next coming years so that we can look once and then look for change. And that requires us to be really careful about the data source in its first stage. I know that a couple people have already mentioned concerns about global representativeness in these data sources, and I wonder if there's any other comments that we can bring in as we look to the last minutes of today's meeting. Again, the floor is still open, but I also welcome your inputs in writing to show us which data sets are useful and which gaps are still present. I see Ismail's hand. Please go ahead.
Well, I wonder whether this monitoring exercise would be an opportunity for making the case on the need for open tools of science. So the type of infrastructure that's been argued. So it's not enough that we can go to dimensions if it's proprietary, because then it's not sufficiently transparent. So I think it is important to make the case that the Global South has been terribly underrepresented in the carrying monitoring tools, and that it is about time that this representation is carried out. So I would take this opportunity of making the case on the need of this genuinely open way of looking into science.
Thank you. That's a great point. Yes, we want to work openly as we monitor open science, and then shed light on the possibilities for further opening up, not just science itself, but its monitoring. Thank you. One last call for inputs here before I pass it over to Ezra. I want to thank everyone so much for their time. Joe, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, the dogs are quiet now, I hope. Regarding open data, I just realized also at the World Science Forum, by the way, it suddenly occurred to me that with regards to Africa and probably also in many other world regions, open data should not be the norm, just because that might easily lead to another wave of misappropriation of data ownership, where data ownership cannot be catered for with the infrastructure and capacity that we currently have. So I would highly argue for, and I'm happy to put this to debate for maybe not today, but another time. I would highly argue for, when it comes to data, yes, open, but it should be not CC0. So yes, open, but CC by SA, share alike, so that any data set that evolves from a data set that has been shared from, in our case, Africa, remains open as it progresses. I just want to put this out there. I don't know, because there's many open data initiatives which demand for CC0 as in sharing data, and this is just not feasible, not for the industry, not for any open science uptake in society, implementation, and also not for reaching equity anytime soon, in my view. But I'm open to just.
It's a great point, yeah, and it's part of not making open science a competition, right? It isn't about me being more open than you because I'm better. It's looking at what are the challenges facing openness and what does openness mean in different contexts. Before I could wax on that all day, but I'll let Anna speak.
Yeah, and also openness is not always the best way forward. There's a lot of, besides sensitive data, when it comes to medical data, there's many other data that are sensitive, but yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Tiffany, and also Joe, Ismail, everybody who has contributed here. I think this is very good discussion. And I think the idea with this open science outlook that we would like to publish on around November with some of the first status and trends of open science globally, I think that's really the place to actually show some of these messages and say some of these things to make sure that, yes, there are some data that exist. These are some examples that we can show, but this is not the actual situation. And we also have to make sure that, you know, the data and the representativeness from the South is more present, etc. So very well noted, the comments that you've had, these reservations, concerns. I think we absolutely agree that the idea is not to take whatever existing data sets exist or data sources and to say, okay, this is what open science is, and it's going well or it's going badly. It's going well for this country, not for that country. That was not the idea, and that's not what we would like to do. So, but we will definitely make sure to balance out these considerations about openness, about equity, about science as a global public good against some of the data points that we have, so that we can see evolution in time of open science practices. And we'll make sure that that is correctly represented in the Outlook. And we will definitely also get your inputs before and feedbacks before this Outlook is released publicly. So that was all from me, Tiffany. I think you can continue now, pass it on to Ezra for closing now.
Thank you. Yes, and indeed, that's that will be just my plan, is just to thank everyone for your inputs and remind you again that we would love to hear more from you. Again, you have the documents in front of you now to review. We welcome your inputs. You can always reach us at openscience@unesco.org. With that, I will pass it to Ezra with thanks to close the meeting.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Tiffany, and thank you to you and Ferry for that, and of course to Anna for the earlier session. And I guess more importantly, thanks to everyone for all the inputs, for the good discussion, as well as the comments in the chat. All very useful has been said, and we'll certainly go through all those comments to capture them, to make sure those points are also captured in the reporting and in our amendment or modifications and updates to those two documents. Okay, so now let's just in closing, we have a few minutes left. Let's just very briefly go through the next steps, just to let you know the plans. So 5th February, not a huge amount of time. So the revised survey based on today's discussion and the analysis of the available databases, we'll go through that and provide those to you by 5th of February. And then please request comments from this working group on the revised survey and any additional indicators or databases, which, as Tiffany just said, to openscience@unesco.org, and that will be on the last slide as well, by 20th of February. So, okay, a few weeks then to do that, but a reasonably quick turnaround, I guess. So in addition to this, we will also be preparing the first quantitative analysis by 10th of March, so early March. And then we'll have our next meeting to discuss the draft monitoring framework in April, May, and we'll decide on some suitable dates and come back to you shortly with a proposal of those dates. And all that, hopefully, following, as I said, referring back to one of the first slides on the timeline, hopefully this will enable us all to meet our June deadline for this working group to prepare the various things. So just really to mention as well for the other working groups, you see the first one here was our first one of the year for the monitoring framework, and we have a number of meetings for the other working groups. So if you're interested and aren't already part of those, or just to remind you if you are, the capacity building, the next discussion on the capacity building working group is on the 20th of February. Then we have 2nd of March, Open Science Infrastructures, 15th of March on funding and incentives, and on the 3rd of April, policies and policy instruments. So if you're not part of those and wish to be, please follow this QR code or just look at the Open Science Working Group web pages. And if you have any problems, please let us know and we'll help you find the relevant information on that. But you're welcome to join those groups if you did already or if you didn't already. So please feel free to join those. We can jump to the next slide, please. Okay, here, hopefully everybody's aware of this Open Science Toolkit, and much of our work in this working group and the other working groups has led and will lead to compiling and putting together all the various elements for this toolkit. If you're not aware of it, if you haven't already got a copy, please again scan the QR code, find the information through the link on our webpage. It's already got some excellent materials in there, so thanks to everyone for all the contributions and assistance in providing this. All the inputs we had from the working groups and from our partners and experts is very, very much appreciated. We've got some very good material there. Please feel free, or I would say more than that, we encourage you to share this with colleagues and anyone that you think could be interested. And we're working together on building the additional things for that. And we've had one good suggestion already of a nice addition which we can do fairly quickly, and we're working on the other elements that we've committed to doing in that. So it's a thank you, but it's also urging you please to get a copy of this, download it if you haven't, and please share it with anyone who you think would be interested. Okay, that's the advert part over, and then really to conclude, it's just to say, yeah, I've said it many times, follow the QR code, log on to the website, or please send us an email if you need any assistance with any of this or for more information. We've asked you several times and given dates, so please, we very much appreciated all the inputs today and in the past, and invite you to continue. So if there are things you've put in the chat you wish to give us a bit more information about, we'd be very happy to that. Some of those comments we may follow up on for a bit more information, but please, yeah, feel free, and we encourage you to provide more. So yeah, just really in conclusion, you know, thanks so much to everyone. Thank you very much for taking your time to join us, to participate, to provide your inputs and expertise. I think it was a good discussion on both of those two elements. I think we've received some very important guidance and suggestions, some very broad and some very specific, and both are very appreciated. Some good examples of you know, things which are already being collected, and the necessity to avoid overlaps, but also benefit from where data and information is already being collected and collated and so on. So I'd really, in closing, just like to say, you know, thank you very much indeed for your interest. Thank you very much for your time. We very much look forward to inputs from you and our continued discussions. So thanks very much to everyone.